Hello. Today we're going to be talking about the Italian Renaissance. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen. And if you remember, the last lecture was on the Proto-Renaissance, the late medieval. Okay, and so you will hopefully remember that we talked about the evolution from these Byzantine style icons into the greater modeling of Giotto, right? And the sense of weight of the figure, the depth created by this illusion, right? And how different it is from even his teacher, Ciambue's flattened, but still slightly more naturalistic than icon figures. And we talked as well about the Arena Chapel and everything that that entailed. So the Proto-Renaissance, which is again what we previously discussed, is roughly 1200 to 1400. And it's a transition away from this flat Byzantine style into greater naturalism, etc. And so while this does go until roughly 1400, in 1348, the Black Death strikes, and it wipes out almost 50% of the population. And this is what ends the Proto-Renaissance pretty effectively. So keep in mind that it is not just 1 year when the Black Death strikes, right? It is much longer. And it leads to massive changes in economic and social structures, in large part because you are losing people from all realms of society. And so the people who are left can command higher wages for their work, etc. So you really need to be able to employ these people, and you no longer have such an abundance of labor available. Okay, and at this same time, literacy is becoming more common. Mentioned in the last lecture, the rise of the vernacular as part of humanism. So instead of publications being entirely in Latin, we're starting to see more being published in the language that everyone is speaking, Italian. Okay, the printing press makes its debut in 1440, so a little bit later than. But there is a slight change in terms of literacy rates, etc. So today we're going to be talking about the Italian Renaissance. And the Italian Renaissance is going to focus a lot on antiquity, right? So why did I spend the time making that, that video that focused on, right, the classical, the medieval? Why does that matter? Well, this is why it's so important. So the Renaissance is vastly different from the Byzantine and medieval styles that came before, and it's looking back to the classical era. Okay, it is a revival of antiquity and classical modes of expression, etc. And so at this time, they are rediscovering the works of writers such as Plato, Aristotle, okay? They are rediscovering the art and the architecture of this time. And it is characterized by humanistic principles. So humanism, right? Think about what the root word of humanism is. It's human. So the emphasis is on the individual. So we talked how, I talked about how these cathedrals are being built for the glory of God, right? And how we don't know the names of these artists simply because that was not the point of creating. The point of creating was to honor God, and you had very strict commissions that you would fulfill, etc. And so we have this Gothic architecture, which really exemplifies quite well the mindset of the medieval time period, right? So it is irregular. Look at how these two towers are so different. It is intricate, but it is also very, very much pointed towards the sky, right? And think about what's in the sky. So that is heaven, okay? So these are pointing towards gods. And again, to God. And again, right, you have the anonymity of the artisans and the artists who create these works, okay? And you have a lot of this irregularity, like these flying buttresses here on Notre Dame that we talked about, Okay, again, like pushing towards God, etc. So these are all characteristic of the medieval and Gothic period. And when we come to the Italian Renaissance, do you see how different this is? Okay, so this is the Pazzi Chapel, and this is built by Brunelleschi, and it is very much a revival of classical ideals. So the Renaissance seeks to both revive and even surpass cultural ancestors. Okay, so you have this revived interest in antiquity and classical ideas and humanism and the rise of the individual in a naturalistic style. Okay, and you also have this renewed emphasis on math. And you can see how extremely logical this structure is. Okay, so you have these columns, it's evenly divided. If you split it down the middle, it would be a mirror image. Okay, it's extremely logical, it's extremely mathematical. And you can see that this is characteristic of almost all of the buildings that are built in this style at the time. Again, highly logical. An emphasis on things like pillars, right, which is from antiquity, okay? You can have it be fancy, but sometimes they're more plain, as this one is. Again, extremely logical, echoing the architecture of antiquity, of Greece, of Rome. So if I go back, right, instead of having something logical and mathematical like a pillar, right? You're looking at flying buttresses. And so think of like the shift in mindset that you would have to have in order to go from this to this Tempietto by Bramante, right? And it's extremely logical structure, okay? Just think about that. It's really quite different. So some aspects of humanism that I'm going to go over, and I will leave the Tempietto up for you so that you can kind of think about how this ties in with the aspects of humanism that I'm going to talk about. So humanism includes an emphasis on education and educational reform in an attempt to expand knowledge and explore individual potential, as well as commitment to civic responsibility and moral duty. There's this attention to classical culture. So as I mentioned before, you're rediscovering the classical texts such as Aristotle and Plato and Socrates and Ovid, etc. And again, you are moving away from Latin towards the vernacular, right? So you have greater educational attainment, and you also have a greater amount of knowledge being produced for the masses. And again, with the printing press, right? We talked in class about how you have works on paper that are created, right? So you have a plate that you ink, and then you push it down on paper and you press, and that ink is transferred. And it's the same thing with a printing press for books. So you would make an entire sheet of text, and then you would just print the same thing over and over. And prior to this, you had been, let me just show you. So prior to this, books were formed as illuminated manuscripts. And so these would be written by hand. They would often be written by monks or by nuns. And you can see how these are extremely elaborate, and they would have taken an extremely long time, okay? So here you can see this attention that is paid to the detail, right? But then there is also this extreme amount of time that it would take to create this writing and this calligraphy, okay? So think about the level of work that is required in order to make something like this, and the level of expense that would go into this, right? This is not something that's accessible to lower classes. And this is not paper, okay? This would be vellum, which is skin from an animal. So again, right, there's a huge expenditure in terms of materials, just the raw materials that go into this. So the fact that you have greater education for the masses and you're publishing for the masses is huge and massively, massively different. Okay, so previously there had been focus on the divine to determine the outcome of your life, but the Renaissance society, in looking back at classical times and antiquity, starts to become more secular. So there's still a fervent belief in God, but at the same time you have more interest in secular things. So things like math and knowledge and the myths of antiquity, right? And so you can see this in things like classical subjects from history and mythology. We're going to see things like one-point perspective, which is a mathematical approach to rendering something in a naturalistic way, which is rediscovered in the Italian Renaissance. It's something that was known in the ancient world, in antiquity, but was not employed or utilized or even known in the middle period, the Middle Ages. Okay, so at this time, there's this focus on achieving and excelling through hard work, as opposed to simply trusting in God for your salvation. And you have more concern with the individual. You have more concern with a naturalistic portrayal with accurate anatomy. And you also have the revival of portraiture, which, when you think about it, really is a rather self-aggrandizing form of art. And you have average citizens who are participating in civic and religious art commissions. So in Florence, which is where we're going to spend a lot of time, you have the rise of the Medici, okay? And these are a bourgeois family. They're wealthy bankers, and they become de facto rulers of Florence. And one reason is that they are so powerful is that they have formed an alliance with the Catholic Church. So while there is less reliance overall on the Catholic Church, it is still an extremely important part of everyday life. And the Medici are very closely tied with the Catholic Church. They become the bank for the Vatican, for the Pope, his personal bank, and even 4 family members of the Medici become popes. They marry into royal families, okay? So it is hard to overstate just how important and powerful this family is. Okay, and they establish an authoritarian rule. So they have constitutional forms, and semblance of democratic government is abolished at this time, but at the same time, you have stability in Florence. And so this is really a relatively peaceful time. And this is something that's kind of new. So this is a big deal. So coming back to this Renaissance architecture, right? So you can see that this is something that is firmly grounded in the earthly world, and it's intensely rational. It's intensely symmetrical, okay? And so this is kind of a really good starting point for you to understand what we're moving into with the Italian Renaissance. So, and another example. So this one is, again, very symmetrical, intensely rational. This is a facade for a much older building. The facade was built in the 1450s, and the original was from 1278 to 1350, okay? But again, you can see these very rational mathematical forms, these squares, okay? So everything is very logical. But the artworks that we're going to start with are the baptistry doors. So in the mid-1300s, you have baptistry doors that are designed for the Florence Cathedral. And in 1401, they end up holding a competition for doors for another doorway on this cathedral. And the subject is the sacrifice of Isaac. And so you still have medieval elements, right? So this quatrefoil, which is this shape, this bulbous, pointy, right? This is a very medieval form. And this form is being used in order to mesh well with the medieval doors that were created. Okay, but you have this competition, and you have artists who are striving to create very naturalistic scenes. So this is by Brunelleschi, And we have only 2 panels, this one as well as one by Ghiberti. And you can see that they're both depicting the same subject, but Brunelleschi is more solid, and he depicts a certain violence in his imagery. So this is the story of Abraham, who is basically the founder of the Jewish nation. And he's told to go with his son Isaac up to a mountaintop and there make a sacrifice to God. And it turns out that sacrifice is to be Isaac, right? So it's to demonstrate Abraham, who's pictured here, his devotion to God by sacrificing his only son, Isaac, pictured here. And God is testing Abraham, and when it becomes clear that he plans to kill his son as a sacrifice to God, God sends an angel, visible in the upper left-hand corner, to stop Abraham and presents him with a ram in the near vicinity to sacrifice instead of Isaac. So this is the story that you're seeing depicted here. But this one is, there is some level of depth and naturalism, but you can see how everything is kind of stacked in order to create a sense of distance instead of creating a truly true depth, okay? And here you can see that it's much more emotional, it's much more flowing, it is more graceful, and you have this extreme foreshortening, okay? Which we talked about last lecture with Giotto, and some of these are even carved in the round. So this is extremely three-dimensional, not carved, made in the round, sorry. So it turns out that Ghiberti's is the one that won, and he ended up designing the doors. So the doors can be seen here, and you can see how, again, it maintains the medieval quatrefoil, but you are still seeing a lot of this depth, etc. So these are the doors that were created about 50 years earlier. So these are not the Italian Renaissance doors. These are the doors that Ghiberti actually made. And so you can see he has abandoned the quatrefoil, the medieval form, and he's adopted this sense of depth, of vanishing, okay? And so the Italian Renaissance is when we start to see the vanishing point come into being. And I'll get into that in just a moment. But you can see here that there is classical architecture in the background of all of these. There's a sense of depth and of space that is created, okay? This three-dimensionality, etc. So there's a lot going on here, and these are very different. All right, so continuing on with our march through the Italian Renaissance, okay? We're going to be talking about Masaccio. And he only worked for 6 years, and yet in that time he completely transformed Florentine painting. And he used color not as a decorative pattern, but to help impart the illusion of solidity to a painted figure. All right, and so this is paintings in a chapel. So think about the Arena Chapel that we looked at before, okay? So it's a similar sort of setup where you have these various registers. Remember how there are 3 registers here, these rows, and they create cycles. So they relay stories sequentially, okay? And so it's something similar here. So we're going to talk about the tribute money. And this is quite revolutionary. So again, there is still some maintaining of medieval forms. So here you see 3 separate depictions from the same narrative, so 3 storylines. So basically what this story is that a tax collector approached Jesus, and tax collectors were very unpopular. As you can imagine, because of taxes, but also it had to do with Roman rule over the Jews. And so he approaches Jesus and asks for taxes. And Jesus sends his apostle Peter, who's depicted here in the orange, to fish and to pull up whatever fish comes to him first. And so Peter is here on the left depicted as fishing, and the fish that comes to him, he he fishes it up, right? I'm not a fisher person. I don't know all the technical terms, apologies. But anyway, so he gets this fish, he cuts it open, and there is a coin in there. And then he shows it to the tax collector and he says, whose head is on this coin? And it's Caesar, right? And he says, give to Caesar what is Caesar, give to God what is God. So he avoids this question of, should we pay taxes or no? Because it's civil disobedience to not pay taxes, but it's unpopular, etc. So there's a long story here. And on the right, what you see is Peter giving the tax collector the coin. So what's important to notice here is that color is being used to create form. Okay, so do you see how he is depicting light and shadow to give a sense of depth and form here? So in the Brancacci Chapel, the light would come from the upper right-hand corner. And you see this same lighting here in this image. And so it's intended to create a sense of illusion, right? That the lighting is the same here as in the chapel, etc. And it creates this pronounced 3D effect. Okay, so you have a couple of things going on. The first is that Jesus and his apostles are all depicted in classical attire, these robes. But what you might notice is that the tax collector looks quite different. And he is actually depicted in contemporary Florentine dress. All right, so this is a way of differentiating him from Jesus and his apostles, as well as introducing the viewer into the story, right? Because this is someone from their own time. And what you're seeing are a couple of phenomena, such as atmospheric perspective. So atmospheric perspective is the idea that the farther back an object is in space, it becomes blurrier and less detailed, and it also becomes more blue and smaller. Okay, so instead of stacking things vertically in an attempt to show depth, what you're seeing is things become smaller and smaller and bluer in the background. And this is, again, a very revolutionary concept for the time. Okay, and so this is more of the Brancacci Chapel. He also paints the expulsion of Adam and Eve from Eden. And so once again, think about the lack of emotion that we have seen in the medieval period, right? So with these icons, you have these very flat, emotionless faces that look almost mask-like. But here we see extreme grief. So Adam and Eve are kicked out of the Garden of Eden, right? Which is like a magical place because they have disobeyed God and sinned, and now they are ashamed of their nakedness. But look at the amount of emotion that is portrayed here. And you can see the giornato that we talked about in the last lecture, right? So the concept of only doing as much in one day, putting down as much plaster as you can paint in one day, because these are frescoes. All right. So, and this is what the Brancacci Chapel looks like overall. But this is a very important work, also by Masaccio, and this is 1426 to 27. And this is the first known, still existing use of one-point linear perspective. And this is the idea that there is one vanishing point, and so you would identify where the vanishing point is. And in this case, it's the foot of the cross here. So between Mary and John the Evangelist here. And so everything will come into this vanishing point via diagonals. So you would identify the point and then draw your diagonal lines. So these are called orthogonals, and you would draw them to every corner of the canvas or wall, whatever, in order to make sure that your perspective is correct. And so what we see here is this use of one-point perspective, again, the first that is known. And you can see how this creates a sense of an architectural setting that is very convincing. And the vanishing point is here, as said before. And then below you have this tomb with a skeleton to remind people that sin causes death, and this is where we will all end up, and Jesus died for our sins. And again, you see donor portraits on either side. So these are the donors. And again, this is a way of reminding God how devoted they are, how much they have donated to praising God. But it's also a way of portraying yourself. And this vanishing point is about 5 feet high. So it would be roughly eye level. And so you would look up at Jesus on the cross being supported by God the Father, and you would look down on death. Okay? And this is a very, very rational, convincing depiction of God the Father in an architectural space. And it's continuing Giotto's more realistic style to its logical conclusion. Okay, so again, this emphasis on math, on logic, etc. Okay, I'm going to unfortunately have to go through a lot of these without really stopping. This is Donatello. This is St. George, and what you see here at the bottom is one of the first instances of using lines, incising lines to create this sense of depth in a very shallow bas relief situation. So you can see here, right, the architectural elements that are mimicking antiquity, and in the foreground you have these larger figures who are three-dimensional, and the lines become fainter and fainter as they travel into the background. So again, moving forward, okay, so you have the Feast of Herod, and again, this is an example of linear perspective. So you can see how the architectural elements become smaller and smaller, and even though you have people stacked slightly vertically, it's clear that these people are in the background due to the smallness of their size, etc. And what you see depicted here is called the Feast of Herod. So remember how I used the stick figure life of Christ to show you that John the Baptist gets beheaded because Salome does the sexy little dance, and then this head is presented to Herod, who gives it to Salome. And so what you see here is the head of John the Baptist being presented to Herod, and everyone is recoiling in horror. So you have both this mathematical vanishing point, as well as the emotion, this emphasis on the individual human. Okay, again, we have the this emphasis on the individual. We're starting to see nudes, which were unheard of in the Middle Ages, essentially. And this is harkening back to the classical era. Again, we see the contrapposto, which we discussed in terms of classical art, and the choros, how they were standing with their knees locked like this, but then they realized that like you would bend one knee naturally, and then your hip would pop out slightly on the other side. And so again, this is a much more natural depiction, as well as being a nude, which is unusual for the time. So keep moving. Okay, Fra Angelico, wonderful. Unfortunately, I don't have time to stop and talk about Fra Angelico. We're going to be talking about Mantegna next. So this is Mantegna, and he is famous for painting the Palazzo Ducale in Mantua. And we're going to see roughly two types of painting. And one is going to be focused on line, and the other is on color and light. And so Mantegna is an example of this focus on line. And he's the first fully Renaissance artist of Northern Italy. And his paintings have a very sculptural quality to them. So I'll come back to this. But you can see here, this is a painting of Judith and Holofernes, and we're going to be seeing a lot of Judith and Holofernes. And you can see she looks like she's a sculpture, right? There is color, but it's not really used for modeling. She looks like she's carved out of marble. Her skin is quite pale. There's this heavy, heavy emphasis on line. And what he's most famous for are his paintings. So he did paintings of this family, and this is their palace in which they lived. And these are illusionistic paintings, like we talked about with the Arena Chapel. And you can see that the landscape is in the back, the vanishing point, Okay, and he is really emulating antiquity. He's very severe. There are no soft edges. These individuals are stoic. They're very calm. There's a lack of expression. And he's most famous for this camera picta. So this is a flat ceiling onto which Montaigne has created this illusion of an oculus, or a hole that looks up into the sky. And you can see that there is some extremely strong foreshortening going on here, particularly with the putai, which is what these angel Cupid figures are called. And yeah, finally loaded. Okay, so you can see just how severe this foreshortening is, the way that the folds of flesh are rendered, etc. So this is a trompe-l'oeil, which is to fool the eye. And this would have been positioned in the bridal chamber. So for those of you who are not aware, on the night of a wedding, the consummation, or when the couple has sex for the first time, it is actually observed by friends and family to ensure that it is actually consummated. And usually that involves what we might now consider to be an incredibly vulgar display of the blood from the hymen breaking, etc. So this is a jovial depiction of the newlyweds being watched having sex for the first time, because impregnation is a very important part of life at this time. You want to have children, particularly sons. Okay, so moving on, and again, I apologize, I know all of this is very fast. Again, you see the extreme foreshortening here with Jesus. This is his dead body, and although it's not entirely correct in terms of perspective, it does very effectively convey that you are looking at Jesus. He's almost eye level with you. And the feet are technically too large, but again, it effectively conveys what Montaigne is going for. Botticelli. Botticelli is another very famous artist from this time, and he is also focused on line rather than color and form. And his figures have a very sculptural quality. They also tend to be quite stoic. And he is interested in Neoplatonism, which is a comprehensive understanding of the universe and the individual's place in it. And it originates from the 3rd century. But basically, you see this introduction of a lot of mythological subject matter, which is not seen in conflict with Christianity, because one of the elements of Neoplatonism is that earthly love is compatible with Christian theology, because you are finding God's creation, you're finding beauty in all of God's creation, etc. And again, here you see a narrative where this nymph is kidnapped and eventually becomes the goddess Flora. Here you see Aphrodite, but again, depicted in contemporary clothing. Okay, so you have the antiquity mixed with the contemporary. And again, look how sculptural this figure looks. The emphasis is on line, right? Contrapposto, very heavily idealized figure. And the goddess Flora shows up again here. So this is the birth of Venus, again, extremely famous. Okay, so we're all familiar with the Sistine Chapel, but Michelangelo is not the only artist who worked on the Sistine Chapel. And this artist, Ghirlandaio, oops, sorry, we're not quite there. Yes, so this is the artist once it loads. And he also worked on the Sistine Chapel, and he worked in a manner that's reminiscent of Masaccio. But again, there's this emphasis on reality, okay? So you have idealism of myths and depictions of gods and goddesses, but for portraits, you see this emphasis on reality. Okay, and you can see here that there is this unflinching depiction of this man who is aging and has this disease that has permanently disfigured him. And then you have this child looking up at him lovingly because he is the patriarch. But look, you can see here in the profile, the line, Okay, just how important line is to this art. Okay. And these are paintings in the Sistine Chapel. So I just want you to be aware that there's a lot more in the Sistine Chapel than just Michelangelo. So coming to Da Vinci epitomized the humanist ideal, okay? And he is extremely talented in a variety of areas. He acted as, here's the list: painter, sculptor, designer of court festivals, technical advisor in fields of architecture, fortification, military matters, and also served as a hydraulic and mechanical engineer. And Da Vinci lived in the second half of the 15th century until 1519, okay? So you can see that he, yes, this is a better version for what we're talking about. You can see that he's using atmospheric perspective, right? So this concept that things become smaller and blurrier and very blue in the background. So atmospheric perspective. And he also has a convincing depiction of space, right? He's using a vanishing point, and he's known for his use of what's called sfumato, which is this softening, this haze around his figures. Okay, so again, you can see that this is idealized but very delicate. There's somewhat less of an emphasis on line for these figures. Okay, everything is highly detailed, close observation of nature and anatomy. And Da Vinci is known for the Vitruvian Man. So this is based on the theory of proportions by the 1st century BCE architect Vitruvius, and it's imposing the principles of geometry over the human body. So they believed that the working of the human body is an analogy for the workings of the universe. And in order to accurately understand the human body, Leonardo da Vinci dissected somewhere around 30 corpses in his lifetime in order to effectively understand anatomy and biology. Okay, and he was not the only one doing this at this time. So this is not by Da Vinci, but this is showing you this interest in human biology. So this is a figure that has been flayed, i.e. the skin has been removed to show you the muscles. All right, so moving forward with Leonardo da Vinci, again, you can see this use of sfumato, these smoky, hazy tones. And we're going to be talking about the Last Supper. So this is the monastery in which the Last Supper is located, and it was located in the dining hall. So the monks would be eating their meals in the presence of Jesus. And I also want to point out that it has been heavily restored. It did disintegrate very quickly after it was painted, because instead of using the traditional fresco style, he used a different type of paint to paint on the plaster, and it almost immediately started to flake off. But again, so this is the Last Supper, which we saw in the stick figure Life of Christ, where Jesus goes with his apostles to supper and he tells them, one of you will betray me. And so what we're seeing here are the apostles reacting in shock and horror to to Jesus's statement that he will be betrayed. And Judas is visible here to the right of Jesus, and he is distinguishable by his dark skin. And again, you can see the use of atmospheric perspective as well as the linear perspective. So do you see these diagonals, right? So these would be coming from the orthogonals, the diagonal lines drawn towards the vanishing point. And this took 12 years to design and paint. Oh, I apologize. Scratch that, not 12 years to design and paint. This one was much faster. I apologize, that was a stupid mistake. And this is what other depictions of the Last Supper looks like from roughly the same time. So this is 1476, whereas this is 1495 to 98. So 3 years. Okay, so let's see if we can zoom in a bit, and you can see this is actually a very good quality photo. It's just that the paint itself is so poor quality. And you can see here the figure of Judas with the darker skin, while everybody but Jesus reacts in horror. They have strong gestures, okay? So this is a very interesting composition. It's much more dynamic than something like this, which is how traditionally Last Suppers have been depicted. Only 17 known paintings that have survived can be definitively attributed to Leonardo da Vinci, including the Mona Lisa, I apologize, I'm tripping over my tongue today. So this was painted between 1503 and 1506, and then Leonardo kept kind of picking at it until 1519. So this is a portrait of a woman. We're not sure who she is. She's possibly the wife of a Florentine merchant. And it originally would have been bigger. We know this from studio copies, but she has this very enigmatic smile and this very soft modeling through the use of chiaroscuro. So once that loads, I can show you, but with the landscape, again, we have the atmospheric perspective in evidence, as well as these very soft, soft colors that are used to create these very thin transparent layers. And this is a new sort of technology for painting. This is oil paint instead of tempera. And tempera is made using egg whites and color, and it dries very flat, and it dries quickly, and the colors are bright. But with oil painting, you can make very thin coatings, and this enables you to build up to create this very luminous sense, right? So you can feel that there is depth in these layers of paint. Okay, and you can see how this would be a separate layer from what's under it. So it's a very different way of working. And you can see that this is evidenced in just the depth of the eyes and the way that they're depicted and the jawline, etc. Okay, so this is what he spent 16 years working on, but it was not, it's not extant. It was melted down to create weapons. So moving forward, we are, oh, one last thing that I did want to tell you. So Leonardo wrote a treatise on painting, and in it he said, quote, "As far as possible, avoid costumes of your own day, so that we may be spared being laughed at by our successors for the mad fashions of men, and leave behind only things that may be admired for their dignity and their beauty," end quote. So this is a depiction of a woman in not necessarily contemporary clothing, right? Because he's trying to avoid this becoming dated quite quickly. And this is an embodiment of the ideal woman who's beautiful and enigmatic and receptive, yet just out of reach. So continuing forward, we have Raphael, who is looking at the works of Leonardo da Vinci, as well as Michelangelo, who we'll get to in just a moment here. And he has this emphasis on idealized figures. Most of his Madonnas look roughly the same, but very sweet. He paints a lot of religious images as well as images from mythology, okay? So he uses the pyramidal structure, right? So most of his compositions are going to have this triangular structure. And we talked a little bit about this formal quality with something like The Raft of the Medusa by Géricault, which we first saw in the Carters music video. But again, he consistently uses this format in order to create these compositions that are very effective. And again, you can see the use of atmospheric perspective in the back. Again, the pyramid, note how similar this Madonna and this Madonna look, okay? So he definitely has a type, he has a style, and he also is known for oh dear, there it is. Okay, so sorry. The School of Athens. And so this is a depiction of a hall of learning from antiquity. Okay, and in the center, you see Plato and Aristotle surrounded by philosophers of the past and present. illustrating the historical continuity of Platonic thought. And these have very controlled gestures that draw your eye through the group and create a sense of movement. And all of these architectural features are in fact trompe-l'oeil, or illusionary, okay? And it's said that he used faces of artists that he knew in order to create these works. So this is said to be Michelangelo, etc. And this was painted over the series of over 2 years, and this is done in fresco. So again, you can see this use of linear perspective, vanishing point, and this emphasis on antiquity as well as learning and education, and how important secular knowledge is. Okay, so moving forward, the other type of painting that I wanted to show you is most notable in Venice. And so we're going to briefly look at the artist Giovanni Bellini. And so remember where Venice is. It's on the coast. There are canals, and it has this very golden light, very golden quality to the light. And not only do you have a lot of light coming onto you from the sun, but you also have all the water and all the canals that reflect the light back. So there's a lot of light. And so instead of having these very sculptural figures created by line, as we saw with someone like Mantegna or Botticelli, which is the Florentine style of painting, you have the Venetian school, where color is used to create modeling, and there's this light that infuses the entire thing. And it can often be hard to read these images and to know what the story behind them is, simply because there's more emphasis on color and on form than there necessarily is on narrative. So this is a very famous work, St. Francis in the Desert, or St. Francis in Ecstasy, from 1476 to 1478. And again, you see this St. Francis, who is just basking in nature, which is flooded with this golden light, okay? And he's really just glorifying in it. And you can see how he does not look like a sculpture. He does not look stoic. He does not look rigid. He is created through the use of modeling with color and light, etc. And you can see a lot of emphasis on recording nature accurately, as well as atmospheric perspective, etc. Okay, so moving forward, we're going to talk briefly about Michelangelo. And so all of you are familiar with Michelangelo, I'm sure. This is the only work that he signed in his life, and this was created from 1498 to 1500. And although Michelangelo is best known for the Sistine Chapel, which you can see here, the ceiling, for which he's very well known, he thought of himself primarily as a sculptor. He worked with marble for the entirety of his life, although he did also paint, as you can imagine, and he was an architect and a poet as well. And he believed, unlike Bellini, which we were just looking at with the light and the color for form, he believed that drawing is the basis for all art. And so there's this emphasis on line, okay? And he created this work when he was quite young. So he would have been just over 20. And he signed it here on the sash going across her torso. And what you see here is what's known as a Pietà. And a Pietà is the Virgin Mary cradling the body of Jesus after his crucifixion. And so it is a moment to contemplate the sacrifice of Christ, as well as the emotions that a mother would have on holding the body of her deceased child, right? The sacrifice that goes into it on Mary's behalf as well, the grief, okay, the realization of what our sin has created. So this is a very devotional image. And looking at this, we can see that it has a very moving quality. It's very sweet. The face of the Virgin is quietly contemplative. So here you're not seeing a grand expression, explosion of grief. It's much more calm, more restrained. Okay, but this is not entirely natural. So you can see that her lap is actually quite massive in order to be able to accommodate the body of Christ. And she also looks far too young to have a son as old as Jesus. And these are intentional distortions in order to create this effect. And although Michelangelo was criticized for the youth of his depiction of Mary, it was intentional in order to convey that this is a being who is beyond the touch of our world, beyond being aged, okay? And again, he was only 23 years old when he created this piece. And this is what led to the commission of David. So the David is another extremely famous work by Michelangelo. And this piece is, I believe, 17 feet tall. And it was originally intended for a buttress of the cathedral in Florence. But after it was made, people felt that it was too beautiful to be placed all the way up, far out of view. And so that's why he's so big. And you also can see distortions of the body in order to accommodate the height at which David would have been placed. Okay, so you can see that his head is rather small, but again, very stoic, lack of explosive emotions. And you can see the emphasis on anatomy, right, on accuracy, on human biology in the veins that are evident. But his feet and hands, you might notice, are oversized. And that has to do with the fact that this sculpture would have been placed very high and you would have been looking up at it. And so it is to emphasize the hands and feet and to create this illusion of reality. And again, you can see the contrapposto stance as well as this emphasis on the musculature of the body, but nothing too overt. So this is likely a depiction of Goliath after he, wow, so sorry. Depiction of David after he has decided to fight Goliath, but before the battle occurs. So for those of you who may not be familiar, the Jewish people were being menaced by surrounding Philistines. That was the people group. And no one could defeat Goliath, who is a giant. And so all the best warriors try. And then finally, this little skimpy little David fellow who's a shepherd and he's young, he's just a boy. He comes out and he's like, I can take on Goliath. And everyone's like, with what? And he's like, I will use a slingshot and stones. And then miraculously, he does bring down Goliath. So he has a slingshot. He goes, oh, pow. And then the stone goes and hits Goliath right in the center, and Goliath is felled. And then David uses a sword to hack off the head of Goliath. So this is a common theme that we're going to be seeing. And the Florentines identify themselves as being like David. So they see themselves as being small and scrappy, but they're able to stand up to the other kingdoms, right? And so David embodies this feeling. So they have a slightly democratic government, and they feel like they are David standing up to the rest of Italy. Okay, and this was actually entombed in brick during World War II in order to protect it from bombings because it was considered so precious. Okay. So again, another image of the hand, the wrist, the fingers, etc. So now we're going to talk about the Sistine Chapel. And what you see here is an image of the chapel itself. So you have these registers, right, with narratives here and a different register here, as well as the paintings on the ceiling itself. So Michelangelo was brought to Rome to do this. So this is in the Vatican City, which is within Rome, if you remember. And he did not want to. He did not want to paint. He did not want to paint the ceiling, but the Pope told him that he must. And so he started painting it. And he started with a style that was different than what he ended up with. So the walls were already painted and Michelangelo was asked to do the ceiling. So normally you would see single figures on the ceiling rather than scenes. Okay, and so he decides to do 9 scenes from Genesis as well as 12 figures. So you have prophets as well as sibyls. So prophets are individuals from the Bible who predicted the coming of Jesus. Sibyls are secular prophets who are females who were seen as also predicting the coming of Jesus by Christians during the Italian Renaissance. Okay, so you have all of this trompe-l'oeil with the architectural illusions, all right, and these are incredibly detailed, intricate scenes. And this is a scene from Genesis. This is Noah's Ark, which was created to avoid the flooding of the world. And so what you see here is the flooding and people attempting to escape it. And this is one of his earlier images. This is called the Deluge, and it would have been made roughly 1508 to 1512, which is the timeline for the ceiling itself. And it's one of his earlier images because he's putting a lot of work into creating this very intricate, complex scene, which when you're all the way down on the floor and not up close, you lose a lot of the detail. And so he quickly learned that he could have bigger figures, more dramatic gestures with less emphasis on the small details. And one thing about Michelangelo is, again, this emphasis on line rather than color and light to create forms, but his musculature is also very pronounced, and he uses male figures to create female nudes. So these are essentially male figures who lack a penis and instead have breasts that have been just kind of thrown onto the chest. Okay, so again, we're looking at Adam and Eve here accepting the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil from the serpent and being cast from Eden, Garden of Eden. Okay, here you see the creation of man. So you can see how Michelangelo has moved away from the very intricate, detailed scene that you see here into one with fewer figures. Okay, and this is a schematic of what is depicted on the ceiling. Okay, so just some close-ups, incredibly famous. So this is man after he has been created, but before he has the spark of life. And this is God giving him that spark of life. Okay, so these are stable figures. And Michelangelo painted this quite quickly in terms of the amount of space that he had to cover, as well as the detail and intricacy. And these colors are quite vivid. And the reason for that is that the work was recently restored because it's old, right? It's 500 years old, but it also, candle would be used to illuminate this space, right? And so think of the smoke and the soot of 500 years. And so these figures were cleaned and they were found to be much brighter than we had originally understood them to be. Okay, so you can see here painting by someone other than Michelangelo. This is Perugino and his ceiling, as well as his Last Judgment on the end. This is what the ceiling looks like overall. And so you can see why the detail in the Deluge would be lost and why he quickly changed to larger figures with more dramatic gestures. So this is around 1510 that the ceiling is painted, and he's brought back to paint the Last Judgment in 1534. And he, again, is not super thrilled about this, and he has become much more pessimistic. And so what you see is this depiction of Jesus Christ judging souls, and you have the souls who are damned being sent to hell, as well as souls who will be saved, and these are souls being resurrected from the earth. And so what you see here is this mass of writhing bodies, and again there's this emphasis on musculature, so much so it almost becomes distorted. And this is something that we're going to see with mannerism, which we're going to be looking at, I believe, next week. Okay, and you can see here, right, just the mass of these bodies. They are incredibly sculptural, and there's this very chaotic cluster. It feels very frenetic, very nervous, and it's not a very flattering view of people. And he even has Saint Bartholomew depicted here, who was flayed alive, which means that his skin was removed while he was still alive. And what you see here is his flayed skin. This is said to be a self-portrait of Michelangelo. And so you can see how this is someone who is feeling very pessimistic about things. And these forms are less articulate. They're really very fleshy masses who lack waists, etc. And you have some mythological elements here. So this is the figure Charon, who ferries souls across the river Styx into hell. But this is seen as acceptable because Charon was also visible in Dante's Inferno. Okay, but you can see here the despair on these figures, right? And they're clawing, they're trying to claw their way into heaven, and they're not succeeding. Look at the musculature here, right? So really a very grim view of humanity and of what's going on. And Michelangelo was right to be pessimistic. So this was painted 1534 to 1541. And in 1527, there was a sack of Rome. And this was carried out by the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V against the Pope, who was one of the Medici. And so the Pope, Pope Clement VII, who was Pope from 1523 to 1534, he attempted to support France to gain power in the region, and then the Holy Roman Emperor defeated the French army. And so as punishment, he sends 34,000 troops to Rome, and he's not able to pay them. And so these troops decide that they will take payment basically from Rome. And so they try to get to the Pope and they massacre the guards. They execute roughly 1,000 defenders of the Pope and pillage the city. The Pope is eventually imprisoned and he has to pay a massive ransom for his life and cede territory to the Roman Empire. And he lives in fear of the Roman Emperor for the rest of his life, which, side note, interestingly enough, is why Henry VIII was not able to get an annulment to Catherine of Aragon in order to marry Anne Boleyn, which is why he ended up breaking from the Roman Catholic Church and founding his own church so that he could divorce Catherine of Aragon. So it's interesting how all these things are connected. But basically, this is a reign of terror in Rome. And the soldiers remain in the city until February of 1528. So from May 1527 to February 1528, you have all of these imperial soldiers residing within the city. And the population of Rome was 55,000 roughly before the attack, and it drops to 10,000. 6,000 to 12,000 of that number were murdered, but there were also many who died of diseases because of all the unburied bodies. Okay, so things are grim, things are rough, and this is partially what is being reflected in Michelangelo's painting that we see here. So hopefully that gives you an idea about the Italian Renaissance, and I look forward to speaking with you about the Northern Renaissance.